Well, one of the things you get asked to do as NIH director is to issue a lot of welcomes to meetings, and those are always delightful, but oftentimes forgettable both by the person speaking and the people listening. It's more challenging to try to summarize a meeting, and I occasionally get asked to do that, and I always like it better if it's a meeting I've been able to attend. And this one, I'm happy to say, fits that model pretty well, although I did get pulled out of here a little bit yesterday for other things that were going on. You may not have realized that there was a G7 summit happening right through the wall there about Alzheimer's disease, with people from multiple different countries coming here to try to figure out how we're going to coordinate our research efforts in Alzheimer's disease. And then there was another thing I had to run downtown for. But I got pretty well filled in by those who were taking wonderful notes in the course of my absence. And I've very much enjoyed and learned from the course of these discussions over the last 2 days in the way that I hoped I would, but I think it's even gone beyond that expectation. It's an amazing gathering of people that have dropped everything to come here and spend these 2 days together, not just to get away from the snow in Boston, but because you really wanted to be part of a conversation that I think you perceived, and correctly so, was likely to be very consequential, maybe even historic. It's always hard then to try to distill the many things that have been put forward into a brief summary. I will try to do that. Basically, I've been trying to capture points all the way along under various headings, but please do not assume that the things that you see are going to be the outputs of this meeting in anything other than the most sketchy way, because this is a little bit of a free association of things that I found particularly interesting, and most of them in need of further exploration. But having bright lights shone on them by your discussion made it clearer to me what are some of the things that we need still to do. And there's a lot that we need to do. So I'm going to run through some of those points, and then I'm going to ask Rick and Kathy to come up and talk a bit about what are the next steps in this process of trying to define what we're really going to do here. And then I'll jump back up and say a brief word of thank you and farewell. So, right at the beginning of the meeting, and again in the breaks and other conversations that popped up in the course of the 2 days, is this very fundamental question. What is the problem that this cohort is trying to solve? And it would be very helpful to be able to articulate an answer or many answers to that in a series of compelling, what I would call use cases, although what I will suggest to you are actually broad areas of potential use. They're not specific. But I do think it would be very helpful for all of us to keep thinking about that. I don't want it to be hypothesis limited here, because we can go too far down that road and say, well, here are the 10 experiments that we need to do, and we better design the study to do just that, because that will be pretty lethal, I think, to the potential of an effort of this sort that has so much promise to answer questions we haven't thought of yet. But it would be good to have some. So here are a few that came up in my discussions with some of you. And I'll just try them out on you, but this is just a short list of 7. And clearly, we're going to need to work on how to expand this list and maybe also how to make them more precise. So first of all, if you have 1 million people, and you're tracking them longitudinally, and some of them are going to have medical events, and you will have collected data on them before those events have happened, you're going to have a chance to identify and test a wide variety of biomarkers and predictive strategies for lots of common diseases, because in the course of a few years, you'll have opportunities to see who develops those diseases. That is something that could be extremely valuable. Frankly, the genetic part of that will be the smallest part. The part that will probably be most valuable are all those other analytes that you're going to be able to track in individuals for whom you have this longitudinal data on this scale. And that ought to be pretty interesting. Along with that, second one, I mean, we have various ways in which we make predictions about risk of disease, but they're almost always based upon biased samples. And here's an opportunity to find out more quantitatively and in an unbiased way what those risks, whether it's environmental exposure or genetic risk factors where you can now actually determine penetrance, or even begin to look at gene-environment interactions, although that's going to be the toughest one of all because of the power issues. You will, and we talked a lot about this morning, have what I think is a much needed and very powerful test bed for mHealth applications, to health maintenance and chronic disease management to actually find out, do these things work? Do you get data that you can trust, and do they actually improve outcomes? And I think we don't need to skip that step at a time where there's so much potential here, and this would be a place to do a lot of that kind of testing. As I said in the very first comments yesterday morning, I do think this kind of cohort is the best opportunity that we're likely to have for a rigorous test of pharmacogenomics, because you'll have people with genotypes who are going to need drug prescribing, and there will be an opportunity to do this in a much more systematic way than our current difficulties present. The Human Knockout Project, I think we heard from our friends at Geisinger that already through those many different exomes, you're bumping into people who have really interesting genotypes, some of whom appear to be knocked out for particular human genes, and you have the chance, because in this situation you expect to be able to go back and phenotype those individuals. I gather the Marshfield folks are having some of these same discovery processes as well. Now, to be fair, and Rick Lifton pointed this out to me last night, if you really were looking for loss of function mutations as your primary goal, you would probably not choose an outbred population like the United States. You would go somewhere where there's a lot of inbreeding. You would go to Turkey, or you would go to Pakistan, or you would identify places where you're going to have a much higher frequency of recessive, identical by descent, loss of function mutations. But that's not what we're planning to do at the moment, although we might want to think about connecting up with such enterprises. As we talked about in the course of this, having such a cohort of this sort provides you a much-needed test bed for improving the utility of electronic health records, not just for researchers, but for the participants themselves. We need that kind of a laboratory on a scale of this sort to find out how to do this better. And similarly, especially if those who are in fact the cohort original providers are also giving healthcare delivery, you have the chance for shortening what is otherwise a dreadfully long cycle time between evidence being generated and evidence being applied in healthcare delivery. So those are a few things, but I would love if all of you would think about that and send emails, well, I'll tell you who in a minute, to send them to, Kathy, if you have other compelling use cases. We need to kind of be sure we've thought this through. Why are we doing this, and what will we get out of it? Okay, so that was sort of first point here. And again, I think use cases are great. We need to be careful not to say that everything we come up with are going to be the only reasons to do the effort. Okay, a big question that was raised almost immediately and got discussed several times because it kept popping up is, what is the right blend of bringing together existing cohorts, which all have the advantage, of course, of having already collected a lot of data, so you're not starting to do data collection from the beginning, and starting new ones. And I'm intentionally putting this forward not as a, well, it's one or the other. I think it's probably both and, but exactly what's the right blend if you wanted to have an ideal cohort and you had to figure out how to pay for it, because let's be clear here, there's probably not going to be an infinite budget for this. I don't think we can answer that right now, because I'm not sure we've figured out what is the practical potential here of the blend of existing cohorts, and if you could do that, what would you be really sorry you had missed, and how could you figure out how to fill that in? That's going to be a very important task for the next step. Along with that, one could ask, okay, there are lots of other activities in this space, both in the US and beyond. What's unique about this? And maybe that comes back again somewhat to those use cases. And why is 1 million the right number? I think at the very beginning, I allowed the fact that I hoped we could consider that a floor and not a ceiling. And certainly others, like David Goldstein, talked, I think, quite compellingly about how much better power you get when your numbers get really big. And so we would not, I think, at any point in this discussion want to say that's our definitive goal and that's all we have to reach. If we could do more, we should try to do more if we can afford it. How does the cohort both support discovery and also allow testing of interventions? And what does that say about the way in which the cohort should be designed? This is one of those areas that I hadn't really thought through as much prior to this meeting as I probably should have. Because in an ideal situation, you do want both to have longitudinal data collection, but but you want to have a facile way to involve those participants in interventions, be they testing of some new mHealth way of monitoring chronic disease, or perhaps other means of even doing randomized controlled trials that you would like to quickly enroll participants. The significance of that is that it does mean that cohorts where you do have ongoing point of care connection to the participants are going to have a real advantage, because you don't have to go to that extra complicated leap of getting back in touch with participants and convincing them that they would like not only to have their data monitored, but to be part of an ongoing potential of other studies and interventions. And so that sort of raises this question: how critical is it that point-of-care healthcare delivery is included in cohort structure? Well, it might be if we're trying to do interventions as a significant part of this plan. And as we were just talking about with Eric leading us, how will health disparities be addressed? They have to be part of this plan. Health disparities, from the perspective of many of us, is a very high priority in this country, not only to identify what the causes are, but the interventions that would actually improve that situation. If we miss that opportunity with this kind of large-scale cohort, we will, I think, be very regretful, as will the entire nation. So those were some of the things, but there are more. Are children included? We did not resolve that. That's clearly something that we have had a chance to debate a little bit, but has not reached its natural conclusion, and that's going to require more attention. Sustainability, we all agree value grows over time, but how do you make sure that the sustainability is there, both from the participants' perspective and just from the infrastructure and the funding? We certainly need to learn from prior successful and unsuccessful cohort projects, because there are some of both out there, and lessons should not be missed out on. And we need to link up, as maybe we've tried to do a little bit here by having Rory here talking about the biobank, which has been incredibly useful as a background of a project that's already well along and has thought through many of the issues that we're struggling with. But there are other international cohort projects not represented here, and we need to learn from them as well. Some of them, it's harder to find out about what they're doing. I don't know quite what's going on in China, other than I know they are putting a lot of investment into this kind of a cohort. Eric Lander, when he was here yesterday, and he, I guess, ran back to shovel snow, told some of us about the Estonian project, which actually sounds quite impressive in terms of the way this country has put together, in a very organized way, an effort of this sort. Despite what you might expect, given the history of that nation, they have sort of done the leapfrog thing and landed in a space where everybody has access to their own health information and are available for research purposes. We haven't really talked about, and probably don't really have all the right folks in the room now, and it will be difficult to figure out who those folks would be. In our dreams here, what do we think is the basic data, if we had such a cohort, that we'd want to collect on all of them? What phenotypes would you want to be sure you'd captured? What laboratory data as a baseline would you want to have? And in terms of genotypes, would we start with a SNP chip or an exome chip, kind of the way Biobank has some combination of those? At what point would you go on to whole genome sequencing? Would you stop at exome sequencing? Probably not, because at this point the curves are going to cross pretty soon. But we haven't really gone there, and we clearly would love to have a chance to define what that is once this is really becoming a reality. And an idea that Rick floated this morning that I hadn't thought about is maybe this cohort could also be thought of as not having just sort of one level or one tier. You could have the core, the fully engaged, fully participating participants with electronic health records, lots of laboratory data available immediately for consent for follow-ups. But you could have a larger group who simply agree to have their electronic health records available for researchers to study without a lot of the other expense and involvement, but perhaps then available for recontact if something interesting turns up and you want to reach out to those folks. You could call that cohort light or something like that. I don't know how that would work in practicality, but it does have a certain appeal as not sort of having a sharp, bright line between who's in the cohort and who's not, especially if you're talking about the fact that some of the existing cohorts, if you pasted them all together, don't add up to 1 million people, they add up to maybe 10. And how would you, in fact, think about making the most of the fact that there's a lot of work already done there instead of just selecting some subset. So, okay, that was some of the thoughts about the cohort itself. I think the discussion we had yesterday about participants was extremely useful, and participants not as patients, not certainly as subjects, but as partners, or maybe as Harlan Krumholtz was encouraging us to think of them as members. They're not just at the table, they're planning the meal. We had various metaphors about that, and bringing the food. And we are not going to go down the road here of having a patient subcommittee that basically is check the box to say we have listened, but we haven't really. Joint membership has to be the goal in everything we do from this point on. But we didn't really resolve the question about how to identify those who can fairly represent the participant voice for this initiative. It gets easier once we decide who is in the cohort, because then, as Dan was saying, you could have a systematic way of actually sampling not just some people, but all of them. But before we know exactly who's in the cohort, who speaks for the decision process that's going to be important to come to some fairness here in terms of that kind of voice being represented. And I don't know that there's an easy answer to that, although there are things we could talk about in terms of surveys of sort of the kinds of people that we think should be represented in this cohort for it to achieve its goals. I think we need to be careful, though, not simply to go to the usual voices who have generally come into this space, oftentimes because of a strong motivation, because of a personal or a family health issue, many of them driven by rare diseases, because most of the people in the cohort that we imagine may not have had that experience and may therefore have a different view about how they want to participate in this effort. And figuring out how to do that is going to be an interesting challenge. We didn't really talk about what research data we imagine would be returned to the participants, other than everybody wants to have data back, and obviously this ought to be something participants decide and not me, but it is clearly a topic which immediately bubbles up as soon as you get into the specifics of how people's participation is going to benefit them, and what kind of information can go back, and how is it going to be formulated in a way that makes sense and provides real benefit as opposed to confusion. We talked in this last group of things in the parking lot about this one, about the specific consequence of violation of the prohibition against re-identification, as well as other legal things. And there was a suggestion yesterday that we should look at the Global Alliance for Genomic Health ethics position, and that's clearly something that maybe should have come up even more. That group has done a lot here in terms of thinking about issues about how to put genomic data in the cloud and all of the technical matters, but also the ethical and security matters, and we should try to make the most of the 2 years worth of deliberation that they've already undertaken. So just as a flag for that, we should go to school on what they've already done. And here's another one we didn't really get to talk about, which is, can my brother join? Because, you know, he doesn't happen to be part of any of the current cohorts that we're talking about. But he's like intrigued and highly motivated, and Kathy's mother wants to join, and she's already given Kathy a hard time about why there isn't a place for her to sign up. And I'm sure all of you are probably maybe encountering people saying, hey, this sounds really exciting, I want to be part, and are we going to go with that? I mean, it would be a darn shame not to take advantage of such motivated individuals, but when you start thinking about what that means, do you have to have certain characteristics to be allowed in the club, like an electronic health record? Well, obviously, if the blue button really worked in an easy way, that would make this a little simpler. We have not addressed this. I guess my own personal druthers would be to try to provide such a pathway for people who are highly motivated to take part. And maybe even if that were the case, to identify a few celebrities and encourage them to take part as a way of drawing, you know, greater public attention and endorsement to the effort. You could name your favorite celebrity, and I'll name mine. So that's an issue that I think is going to need a lot more thought about the practical consequences of saying yes or no to that. And I think all of this, maybe that fits into the idea of having people join out of their own personal interest, but we really do need to make the most of what I think is a very compelling part of this, that this is an opportunity to contribute to a larger national purpose, not just one's own care. And I think many people would resonate immediately with that as a motivator to take part in this historic undertaking. mHealth Technologies, I took a few points, many more that could have been put down here. Certainly, from my sense, the good news is there's this amazing proliferation of more than 10,000 of these health apps, and that's great, and all kinds of creativity is being generated by people who know how to make the most of this technology in the present time, but many of them were really not quite sure even what the analytical validity is. And if you really want to know whether this is helping people in the long run, you're going to need more data than we have on most of these in order to assess whether outcomes are actually benefited. And this does seem like it could be a really wonderful role for the cohort. There are barriers in this rapidly evolving field that got mentioned, IRBs, HIPAA, and the regulatory situation, especially if you're going to get to the point where a particular device is going to be shown to improve outcomes, and therefore there's going to be an interest in third parties paying for it, and clearly that has to pass through some regulatory oversight. And my sense was that those issues are being thought about, but there's quite a ways to go to figure out how to get from where we are to maybe where we want to be, and the whole thing is vexed in a good way, I guess, by the fact that the technology is changing so fast that by the time you figured out whether something works, and whether it could actually be approved by a regulatory agency, it is so yesterday that nobody wants to use it. And that's a good problem to have, I suppose, but it's a problem. And we didn't talk a whole lot about the dangers that some people have pointed to. It was in one of the white papers about whether, in fact, privacy and security on mHealth gadgets are in the kind of state that they need to be in order to provide reassurances to patients, because most of the time, frankly, they are not. So the other final thing about this was just concern if we were going to try to have the cohort serve as a wonderful laboratory for testing out various mHealth applications, how do you in fact inspire participants to use them and to continue to use them and not to have this sort of short dwell time of a particular mHealth idea because people just got tired of it. And there must be various ways to do a better job to provide incentives of that sort. Informatics requirements we talked about also, I think, quite usefully. Certainly, a point that I thought was important to walk away with is that the EHR system of the cohort not only needs to be able to facilitate discovery, that is, that you can actually pull data out of it, but also that it facilitates opportunities to do implementation. And that may not be the way in which some of these are currently designed. The blue button technology, which has so much promise in terms of making it possible for people to have access to their own data and own their own data, still sounds like it's got lots of kludges in terms of its ability to be utilized by the average person. And the faster we can get across those barriers, it seems like for this purpose, the better. There was a strong sense that we needed in the cohort model to be able to include things in the record that are not just the things that the provider puts in there based on an encounter, but also how to capture the mHealth data from participants, which many electronic health records are no way, no how ready to receive right now, as well as to really encourage and capture the participant-reported outcomes, from things like PROMIS, which many of you know about PROMIS, but maybe not everybody. 10 years has gone into the development of this patient-reported outcome system, which is now very well validated for lots of conditions. So you really have a way of being quite confident that you are capturing from the patient's perspective whether a particular intervention is improving their circumstance, which is often rather different than what the doc says or what the clinical researcher says. And this idea of having a separate part of the electronic health record, the My Research chart, providing an opportunity to keep some of this information segregated is obviously one we have to think about. It sounds like it would have some real advantages. We heard loud and clear that the access to claims data can be very valuable, and the fact that the death master file is no longer accessible to research, which has been a major negative step, and one that we're actually working on and may have some hopes of turning around through a process in the Congress, because I don't think the consequence of that decision, which was really to try to prevent mischief, was intended to do harm to research, but it did. And then this big question about whether, in fact, the data sets that we would want to see produced here should be centralized or in a more federated structure. I guess the mood of the room was leaning somewhat, maybe 2/3 to 1/3 or something like that in the direction of a federated system, but clearly we need a complete review of the prior lessons from alternatives that have been tried out to get a better sense of that. That's going to be a very important decision. And finally, I guess with electronic health records and the informatics, I think Gonzalo said this yesterday, that the biggest mistake we could make is to make a plan for the kind of data that we know about right now, that this is going to be growing so fast that whatever you have in mind is probably going to be insufficient 2 or 3 years from now unless you start out knowing that and planning for that. So that's going to be a challenge. Data access and sharing we just talked about most recently. I guess we really got this message very clearly from Rory. Don't make the access process so unduly complex. Even though you think you're doing it to help people, you may not be. You need to anticipate extensive interest in these depletable samples and have a system that will adjudicate requests in a fair way. There is all this concern about how many different kinds of regulatory issues will get in the way in terms of data access and sharing, HIPAA, CLIA, FISMA. There are probably other acronyms I could throw in there. And one that we didn't really talk about, other than we learned that at least for some of the cohorts, participants do seem comfortable with data sharing with both public and private sector researchers. I know that's not true for some of the cohorts that are currently in existence, and that may be a pretty big deal in terms of how you make sure that maximum benefit is going to come forth for all the work that will go into putting this together. And maybe the opportunity as we begin to set this up, not to just assume that there are going to be lots of people ready as researchers to take advantage of it, but to think in advance of what kind of training opportunities for data users might be applied. And again, I think there's lots we can learn from the UK about several of these issues. So those are some of my observations just about those main topics. And again, forgive me if those seem a little bit free associated and spotty, because they are, but I hope they in some way jog you to think about the conversations we've had for the last 2 days. Now we probably should think about where we go from here after sort of February 12th has come and gone. And I'm going to ask Kathy Hudson and Rick Lifton, who are going to co-chair the working group of my advisory committee going forward, to come up and say a bit about what the next steps might be.
Thanks, Francis. Well, I'll just start by commenting on what an inspiring couple of days it has been and reflect on 40 years ago, I was an undergraduate and I read 2 papers that really drew me into this field. One was a paper by Tom Maniotis and Mark Potashny sequencing the phage lambda operator sequence, and they captured about 20 bases of DNA that they showed was the binding site for the lambda repressor, and I thought that was awesome. And the second paper that brought me in was a paper by Dave Hogness cloning the first eukaryotic pieces of DNA and mapping them back to the genome in Drosophila. And then from that, intuited that you would be able to unify the physical and genetic maps of genomes. And from that, you could see that you would be able to identify the genes that underlie traits that you could identify and characterize. And to think from that, 40 years ago, we're sitting here today talking about sequencing 1 million people and linking that to electronic medical records of those same individuals and drawing inferences about the causes of disease and the predictors of outcome. I promise you that is something that certainly I, and I suspect nobody in the field, imagined would become possible in the span of a single career. So I think we really are in remarkable times, and I think the opportunity to even think about the projects that we're talking about today are really remarkable and inspiring. I want to also just reflect for a moment that the work that we're talking about today is, of course, not in a vacuum, and Eric Green's, the NHGRI, is planning extensive work to identify the genes that contribute to common disease and additional rare variants contributing to Mendelian diseases. And that work, I think, very nicely parallels what we're talking about here in using that information to begin to make predictions in the general population. And I think those are really compelling synergies that will be emerging over the coming years. And I also think this project is incredibly timely, because if we had conceived this project 10 years ago, the barriers to doing the recruitment and linking to medical records at the scale of 1 million people truly, I think, would have been prohibitive in the expense. And we have the remarkable examples that we heard from Mike Gaziano and Rory Collins about efforts that are already ongoing, assuring that if we do a good job, this is a very achievable notion. So I think the last 2 days have really set the table for moving forward. And as we think about these next steps, we have to take all of the information that came out of the last 2 days and begin distilling this into a format that we can actually think about making an action plan. And our first task will be to set up a working group of Francis's advisory council, and we will be doing that over the next several weeks. And of course, there will be many components that need to be well represented in that working group that will include many of the people in this room who have contributed over the last several days. And part of the goal at that point will begin to drill into some of the issues that have been raised during this meeting, and to begin to think about how we actually reduce the diverse comments in this meeting to a practice and a framework from which we'll begin to outline a plan of action, which we then will bring an interim report to the Advisory Council in September to inform NIH's decisions about how to begin rolling out this project, with an anticipation that this will begin in the next fiscal year, in fiscal year 16. There's an enormous amount of work that remains to be done, as I'm sure everyone in this room appreciates, and I'm sure you, as well as many of our colleagues on the web, will appreciate that and anticipate that we will be calling on you for future efforts to begin helping us formulate a plan that begins to take shape as we move forward. And I'll turn it over to Kathy for further comments.
Great. So I want to associate myself with Rick's comments about what a great 2 days this has been. I have been working on planning this meeting with my colleagues here at NIH for some time, well in advance of the President's State of the Union address and his comments now 2 weeks ago at the White House. And so it's really thrilling to have you all here. It has exceeded my expectations, and I certainly have learned an enormous amount and look forward to working with all of you here in the room and everybody on the web and many others as we seek to put concreteness to this plan. So we will, over the next weeks and months, be seeking to pick the brains of many different kinds of people. We certainly will want to have further extensive conversations with folks who have experience, positive and negative, in having put together cohorts or not having put together cohorts. We want to learn more from the folks who are developing interesting mHealth devices, not only for being able to provide data back into the cohort, but also to be able to test those devices, as Francis mentioned. And then we need to be able to understand what will be the determinants of people's willingness to participate. And we will need to draw on the expertise of great folks such as those in the room, Andrea, Sharon, Judy, and others. But also, we need to hear from and talk to people who are likely or who we would like to be likely participants. And Francis mentioned the potential of doing a survey or other means of outreach to really understand what are the factors that influence people's willingness to participate, their willingness to sign up, their comfort in being able to participate in a cohort such as this. The other thing that we're going to have to do over the coming weeks and months is to figure out how we're going to run this thing. Already we have great relationships with our sister agencies, with the Veterans Administration, which is here, the Department of Defense, which is here, ONC, who is here, and many others who we're going to have to coordinate with closely over the coming period of time as we're setting this up, because we're going to need to rely on their input and expertise and have lots of conversations about how we can work together. And then here at NIH, clearly this cohort is not about a single disease or disorder or organ system, and so it doesn't fall neatly within any particular institute or center. In fact, it affects every institute and center at the National Institutes of Health. And so this is truly going to have to be a trans NIH project. And we have some experience with that. Phil Bourne, who moderated our data sharing session, is coordinating a trans NIH project in big data science. We have a BRAIN initiative that involves 10 of the 27 institutes, and we've figured out means of being able to break through the walls of the silos and have very effective trans NIH collaborations on important and prominent projects. And so I think we can follow that model in putting together a governance model and a funding model for carrying this forward as we get it launched in FY16. So I think that's all we had to say, and turn it back over to you.
Do you want to take any questions about the sort of next steps issues?
No. I don't see any hands.
So, I thought this was a great meeting, and I think a lot of phenomenal issues were addressed. But somebody actually suggested, they didn't want me to give their name because they thought they'd get shot walking out of this room, but they suggested I throw something out on the table here, because this is great, and it's theoretical, and it's far-reaching, and it's far in advance, but it's not here and now. We heard about two great efforts right now, I thought, which to me were the highlights. Rory talking about the UK effort, and Michael talking about the VA effort. But there's actually a third major effort, which is at least competitive, and from a sequencing point of view, I think ahead of all of those efforts, and it's here and now, and it's the Regeneron-Geisinger effort. We've already said that we're on pace to be doing 250,000 people over the next few years, and it's scalable. You guys heard that David's Geisinger, EHR, and database system and so forth actually meet some of the base requirements. And I think this would be a great foundation effort to consider that would incredibly, I think, expedite this program, leapfrog a lot of the issues, and allow future layering on of bells and whistles and so forth, and maybe combining with the VA effort or other populations to add diversity and so forth. But I think that that's one thing that should be considered. We would be glad in some way to include our effort into this million-man database effort, and at least it would guarantee that within the next few years, you'd have at least 250,000 people, if not greatly expedite the ability to get to that million-man number. And as you guys know, as Francis knows, with my colleague here, Chris Austin at the NHGRI, we've delivered before on the Knockout the Mouse Genome Project. And much of our technology here is really the legacy of Francis's and Chris's vision in terms of the Knockout the Mouse Genome Project, which I also think should be considered. If you're knocking out the human, you should also be considering integrating that and harmonizing that with the Knockout the Mouse effort, which I think is really important. So I just thought it's worth throwing that into the table, and this could really leapfrog and expedite the effort, I think, dramatically.
And that's exactly why we invited you and others into the room to have the conversation with us over the last couple of days. Yeah.
Jaquish, NHLBI. I think along those lines, there are efforts here at NIH that are just starting. We're going to have 20,000 whole genomes this year from existing cohorts, a very different model. But it'll give us a chance to play with these different approaches and how we go about building this larger. But we're excited to be a part of this, too.
Thanks. Jeff.
Wondering if you could comment on cancer, since that was not really discussed today. Are these interdependent or independent initiatives? Are we building two separate infrastructures for these, or are they going to leverage one off of each other?
So I think they're going to be interrelated. The cancer part of the project is being really run out of NCI. There's a couple people from NCI who've been with us through the cohort. So oncology is certainly a part of the cohort, But in addition, there is the clinical trial program that NCI is setting up, and it's really, I don't know if you're familiar with the MATCH clinical trial design, and that's really what they're going to be building on, is that innovative clinical trial design to try to look at the molecular underpinnings and then the pathways and the targeted drugs that can be deployed in those cancers. So they're related to one another, but they're really, in terms of planning, they're going through their parallel processes, and so they're using the National Cancer Advisory Board as their mechanism to get external input.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Kathy. Well, not to belabor this because we are approaching the 4 o'clock hour, and I promise you we will be done before we reach the big hand at 12. Yes, there's your picture, people. Not bad, huh? And I would say this was historic. You know, it's interesting the way we lined ourselves up. It looks like one of those ribbons. No, we are not going to be sexist. That is not a Y chromosome. Yeah, unwinding the double helix. Or else it's our logo. I don't know, one of those ribbons that you wear, except I don't know what the color would be here. It's kind of mixed and mingled. Not black. No, there's much more going on here. Anyway, we will be sure to send this around so you can save your own copy. Yeah, make it your screensaver. And by the way, the world has been watching and probably still is, unless they've gone back to do other things that they intended to do on a Thursday. The world, actually, we had 1,741 unique views in the videocast. We had 623 unique views in the WebEx. And as of 2 o'clock, and I'm sure there are more by now, there were 3,813 total tweets. 9 of those were mine, I want you to know. All right. When you get to Twitter jokes, you know it's time to wind up. So anyway, we do need to continue to follow that quote that I gave you at the beginning yesterday from Woodrow Wilson, that he not only used all his brains, but all the brains he could borrow. We borrowed yours really nicely here for the last 2 days, but we're not done with you. We need to continue that process. So please think further about the issues that we've discussed here as you head homeward. Sometimes there's something that comes to you or you didn't quite get to put forward in the way you want to. Send us additional thoughts. They can go to Kathy's address, kathy.hudson@nih.gov. How hard is that to remember? And, when we call you, please return the phone call. And be prepared if we decide we need to have a workshop on a topic and it's got to be 2 weeks from now, that you will just drop everything, just like you did to be here, and come and give us your best ideas, because we are going to be working on a pretty tight schedule here to try to get something together by September that looks like an initial plan and allows us to begin to issue competition opportunities for people to play in this remarkable new space. So finally, I got to finish everything with a quote. One of my favorites actually was one that came to me during the process where we were trying to sequence the human genome, and it was really hard, and it wasn't clear it was going to work, and people were saying, your dreams are just too big. You should have scaled that back a little bit. The quote comes not from a scientist, but an architect, Daniel Burnham. Any of you happen to take the train today? Union Station was designed by Daniel Burnham, but so were a bunch of other buildings in Chicago, and at least one in New York, the Flatiron Building, excuse me. So his quote, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high and hope and work." And it goes on from there. Because a noble logical diagram once recorded will never die, but will live on long after we are gone. That's the rest of the quote. So we're making big plans here, and maybe big enough that it's been a little breathtaking to contemplate putting together something on this scale. But it is magical to be able to contemplate, and certainly after some of us have been laboring through this, trying to figure out a way to make this happen for more than a decade, to be able to be here, to have all of you join in this enterprise, to have the President of the United States put it forward as a priority, even a legacy for his administration. This is a wonderful dream. The dream still kind of got lots of parts of it that need to be filled out. I appreciate all of your input to what we've been able to achieve for these 36 hours, and lots more to come. So many thanks to all of you. Safe travels home. We will move this effort forward with the most vision we can muster and try to do the right thing to benefit the health of the nation and the world. That's what this is about. Thanks. We're done.